We have about 30 minutes now left for question and answer session. Please be brief with your question, and we'll try and take on as many questions as we can. In the end, I'll conclude certain points that I've noted during the presentations, and also based on your questions, I'll take about 5 minutes in the end. Kindly go ahead. Right, Colonel J. Chapel, where is he? Please go ahead. I'm sorry if I have not pronounced your name properly, I apologize.
Thank you very much. My question goes to the first presenter. He rightly pointed out that disaster management is no longer a secondary task for the military. I would want to find out from him if he thinks of any disaster management, especially disaster risk reduction activities that the military could play in a proactive role than in a reactive role, because most of these disaster management activities that he brought out are much more reactive on a smaller scale than geoengineering, of course. Thank you.
I think we'll take on one question at a time, because then, you answer it better. Otherwise, when you club questions together, then perhaps a lot of questions are left out. And I don't want to do that. The endeavor is to put our act together, ladies and gentlemen, collective wisdom at the end of this, so that we can take home certain important issues.
Thank you, Colonel, for the question. In fact, that is what I was trying to raise, that particular question that you mentioned, that now that we know that the militaries are going to be often the first and the only responders, I think time has come for militaries in Asia and Africa especially to factor in the necessity of having a specialized, either a cell or a small group of people or specialists who can map possible disasters, who can map possible, and in anticipation, floods, some of the landslides, areas that are well known. Some of those things can be done by the military and be prepared with proper equipment, be prepared for any challenge that comes up in advance, rather than being asked by the government to go and get deployed and then start finding solutions on the ground itself in an ad hoc manner. So I think there should be, as I mentioned, a lot of planning and factoring in of a possible role, a possible main role in disaster management. I think that the militaries in Asia and Africa especially need to do, because very often some of the countries may not be able to afford another agency for disaster management or relief. So therefore, I think the militaries must start thinking in those terms. If they have got cyber cells to look at cyber threats or cyberspace threats, I'm sure they can look at a separate cell or a separate cadre within their organization to look at disaster relief and disaster management. I think that should be done.
My addition to your question is that the military can do contingency planning. It can also do scenario exercises to prepare themselves. But I'm personally of the opinion, in my understanding of HADR, the military cannot be the sole agency. All HADR interventions should be and have to be civilian-led. The military is only a component into the whole game. It has its own abilities and qualifications and special abilities, but overall, it is a civilian-led operation because it's a complex operation.
Right. Like to say something on this?
I think I would. My two colleagues actually hit most of the points, being that within most nations, and I will use the U.S. as an example, is the military forces are there for either maintenance of stability within the country or protection of the nation's sovereignty external to the country. That is the purpose of a military in general. But the capabilities that that military maintains can be dual purpose in a disaster response. And clearly the United States Marine Corps, probably the best example I can think of with their ability to use helicopters, heavy lift, logistic support capacity, command and control. They have everything that you need to fight a war, but it can be equally applied to fight a disaster. On your question of disaster risk reduction, as I would agree completely, is find ways in which your military engagements can take on disaster risk reduction benefits, which takes some deliberate thinking. And the key to that is figuring out what are your risks, hazards, and challenges. What matters to you? And I would say if you look back at the presentation that I gave is what are the things that you've been asked to do in the past or that have not done well in your country in the past, and focus on those. Because that's what you may as well get good at what you've already been asked to do anyway. On the traditional humanitarian disaster risk reduction or flood mitigation or early warnings or the rest of those, that is largely a civilian-led sovereignty responsibility of a government. But it can be executed in many cases in very creative ways. And I think that across South Asia and other places, you'll find a very deep involvement of the military in response processes because, as was alluded to, they have the capability. So capitalize on that capability, and if you have it, find a way, and it goes to the second to last slide I have, which is how do you coordinate that between the military and the civilian agencies within your own country? Because that aspect of civil-military coordination can be very difficult in certain locations.
Right. Well, I'll be summing up in the end, but just a point on this. It's very difficult to forecast, these kind of disasters. If you can do it, forewarned is forearmed. You can place your resources. But what we have done, I just want to give you a template, for your understanding. We have positioned our resources, manpower, as was brought out by, my colleague on to the right. He said that, Mr. Gokhale, that, the army is all over. Army is deployed pan-India, for example, in our case. What we've done is the stores that are required to fight various contingencies, we place them on a grid pattern, and not only for disasters, earthquakes, but even for the CBRN kind of contingencies. We position them on theater bases, which are available close to the airfield, can be airlifted and taken wherever required. So it's the forewarning which is there. The other thing, the governments of various countries have various methods. And as brought out by the journal, the Oslo agreement or the Oslo guidelines which were given out on the 27th of November 2006, they highlight that it is a civil control ultimately which has got to be, the primacy of the civil control remains when you're carrying out these operations, as he said, so I endorse what he says. But what I'm coming to is that these resources can be utilized only once the government has laid down certain guidelines. In our case, for example, we have Aid to Civil Authority, which is of 1970 vintage, which gives out to the Indian military that the Indian military will get involved in all disaster emergency situations. So it is a mandate given to the army, and therefore we are prepared for it in addition to our primary responsibility. Yes, please. The next question is by Major General Ashok K. Mehta. Sir, please.
Thank you very much. Lest the host country accuses me of not asking a question, I'm going to do so. And I'm also going to differ slightly with the chair, who belongs to my own country. There is a severe danger and a risk in trying to do what we try to do. Our primary task is, as Joseph said, maintaining the sovereignty and protection of the external frontiers. What is actually happening in Asia is that you are already saddled with the tasks of internal security. Take our country, that is India, left-wing extremism, insurgency, terrorism. On top of that, if you pack up disaster relief, for which there is a separate agency, the National Disaster Relief Agency, and they have a very elaborate organization. And like the civil organization, whenever there is a contingency situation, at the drop of a hat, the civil administration requisitions the army. And that's precisely what you must avoid. The task of the military, even for the Sri Lankan military, who have defeated insurgency in the 21st century, continues to remain external security. Whenever that happens, so that your forces are not found wanting in their primary task. That's an ideological difference, but nevertheless, I thought I'd make this. My question is for Joseph. Joseph, you said that, if I got it right, that even before the military reaches, the army reaches, some of these civilian agencies are already there. So in many respects, they become the first responders. They may not have the reach, they may not have the capability, but they are there. And in many cases, they are there. So my question is, when you are doing these exercises, for example, you cited the case of 3 exercises. Do you associate these civil agencies as part of those exercises? And my last question is for this great general from Bangladesh who's painted this horrific scenario. I read somewhere, General, about the Canfield Ocean, C-A-N-F-I-E-L-D, Canfield Ocean, in relation to the kind of the end of the world, the doomsday scenario. Are you, when you paint these strategic geoengineering mitigating scenarios, do you at the back of your mind also think of those 400 million years ago scenarios where those extinctions took place? Or is that part of fiction and not reality? My question, I know, is not very clear, but because since in the morning, artificial intelligence was also in the realm of fiction, is some of this in the realm of fiction, what you are saying, or what you have said?
The aspect of geoengineering is not a fiction anymore. There are active experimentation that is going on. There is limited field-level deployment that is also being tried out now. As we speak here today, there is an experiment going on in Arizona of deploying stratospheric aerosol. So these are experimentation-level reality. These are tried out by nations who have the financial capacity and the technical capacity to deploy such an option for the reason that nothing else is working. Their argument for this is that nothing else of the mitigation techniques are working, and the complex negotiations that we are involved in is such slow and tedious that by the time we get into an agreement and have its positive outcome, probably the damage will be too big for us to cope with. So they are trying to find out alternative pathways of reducing the impact. It's also my understanding they're also trying to lessen the pains of mitigation. So we can continue living the way we do in the West, particularly, and try and artificially reduce the carbon emissions and reduce the impacts by doing experimentation and finally deployment of geoengineering. So this is not exactly a fictional thing anymore. It is something that is really happening. And I can tell you, sir, that the scenario that I'm painting about the impacts is perhaps a very muted one that I have painted. The consequences and the consequence landscape is far, far worse than what I painted. It certainly looks to be a doomsday, but it is going to be a doomsday unless we act together.
Sir, to answer the great question with respect to civilian agencies, I want to elaborate just a little because you really did hit the nail on the head in that every response is local. If your house catches on fire, your neighbors are going to be the first people to help you, and at which point then you call the fire department and maybe you call your insurance company. In a natural disaster, it is very similar, and sometimes even in complex disasters, it's very similar, is that all those disasters are local in nature, and that it is often the spiritual communities or the schools or the local police department, fire department, the rest of that, the local aid agencies, before the state or the district or the Upazilla or whatever it is gets involved, the people are helping each other. Then at some point in that level of disaster response, it gets to the point in which the local organizations can't handle it, and they request assistance from a higher level. And at some point in that, it gets so bad that you may ask for military response, or if in your particular country, the military may be tasked as a specific mission to do that. The Philippines is a great example of that. They do it by district. The point being is that if those military forces do not practice and train with those local civilian agencies, then they're not making their exercises real. In the exercises that we support, so I will mention two specifically, which is Cobra Gold, which is a big exercise we do in Thailand, and then Balakatan, which is a big exercise the U.S. does with the Philippines. In both cases, my organization brings to bear and into this the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, the World Food Program, and other organizations from the United Nations, so that those exercise commanders can get the experience of seeing those aid agencies there in a disaster. I will be specific and complement the International Committee of the Red Cross. So the ICRC this year sent folks to Balakatan in the Philippines, because in this case it was an internal displacement issue and the treatment of civilians. And the ICRC role player got into the face of the one-star Army general, U.S. Army general, because there was a humanitarian issue tied to this that was going to result in an international humanitarian law violation for which he would be ultimately held accountable. So if you, as military organizers of exercise, bring these participants in, be it a local exercise or a national level exercise like I talked about, you will get a better training environment. You will get a more realistic preparation for when you do this for real. And I would offer that your advice to those, understand the local community and try and bring those folks in is very useful. Thank you.
I just want to add one thing to the reply. My question. General, I just wanted to mention one thing to you. I forgot.
Briefly.
And I'm referring to official documents. IPCC's assessment has said that a 1 meter sea level rise will entail a 17 to 20% loss of Bangladesh territory. The Bangladesh government's national strategy paper on climate change has analyzed this and has indicated that a 20% loss of Bangladesh territory will create a 25 to 30 million climate refugees out of Bangladesh. Imagine the number. It will not be Bangladesh's problem. It will be a regional destabilization, induced condition, and a matter of international security. One other small example, the vanishing islands from the Pacific island states. The international community will be completely thrown out in their whole paradigm of understanding of maritime boundaries because of the shifting baselines and vanishing islands. So the whole gamut of the maritime boundary that has been set out of the UNCLOS process will be completely lost, and we don't know the legal implications of other induced conditions in the Pacific Island state which are being lost now.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, to the first issue which the General brought out, he's absolutely correct. Militaries all over the world have their primary responsibility with regard to ensuring sovereignty, unity and integrity of the country, wherever they are. But then, in this particular case, you'll understand that you have moral obligations towards the people who are suffering, people who are dying. You've got to assuage their sufferings. You've got to make sure they are taken out of that area, lives are saved. That's very important. From that point of view, therefore, the moral obligations come in. And I want to share with you, when I was the chief, my directions to the Indian Army was that you don't have to wait for any requisitioning. If there's a disaster, just get involved post haste and save lives. Because that's the moral obligation to save our nationals, our own people. That's very important. Yes, in other fields, as the General said, for example, it has been a debate in our country that the excessive involvement of the army or excessive footprint in the counterinsurgency arena, which actually should be handled by paramilitary forces that have been empowered over the years, we should actually lay off. That debate is on, but then please, we have got to understand that there are certain constitutional obligations. There is the legal framework within which we have to operate. But in this particular case, when you talk of disaster management, as I said earlier, it's the moral obligations which precede the legal stipulations. And as a result, I had passed the orders. I said, don't wait for anyone to requisition you. No state government should be bothered to requisition you. Don't wait for any requisition call to come. Just take off and go. And I just want to tell you that in 2011, when I was the Eastern Army commander, we had earthquake in Sikkim. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, we had concentrated 5,000 personnel with stores in one night. So the NDMA, which he talked about, they were there. The NDRF, those people had come. But my people had taken off in the helicopters to make sure that the people who were suffering were taken out. Doctors were inducted in, food was taken in, medicine was taken in. And that was done devoid of any requisitioning by the state government or by the central government. So I just wanted to clarify this point. I think we can go ahead with the next question, please. Can you put
Hello.
your...
Yes, I'm Jay
right,
Singham.
please, could you give a name, please, sir?
Yes,
And
Jay Singham from Eastern University. Two things. One is, I think, first, as I agree, we are talking about disaster management. I mean, I totally agree with the military side to do the rescue, that immediate response, yes, I mean, they are better than everything else. But if you are talking about the entire mitigation, I mean, there is a lot more civilian thing which comes subsequently, which I think I'll have to agree with Ben and things. It can be preparation, all this. Tsunami, we did that first was the civilian who was at the gate. Then we had all the international forces. Then it has to be civilian again, training them for preparation for the next one. So I think that's fine. Rescue, I think no one else than military. There is no way. Thank you. But the other one, I think I want to ask about the climate change one. I work on environment. We have to be very careful about the climate change. Now, we said the same aerosol, which we said we changed our fridges, we changed that, we changed this, not to put so many things onto the atmosphere. Now we want to do it for some other purpose. So it's like once upon a time we were doing arms race, A, B, both rise. At one time we had to step down. I think we may have to slow down in our technology to see what we can do. As you said, yes, we are going ahead in temperature, but aerosol, if it is going to again inflict on ozone, we'll have another thing what we are talking about. So I think Paris Agreement, I think we'll have to go with it. I think a lot of us will have to rethink, not go into a technology race in terms of something like climate change, but we also have to slow down. If we have to reduce our distances of traveling to work, maybe we have to think of alternatives rather than technology alone is going to solve our problem. Otherwise, the doomsday is not far off. That's my opinion. Thank you.
I think very valid points have been covered by you, sir. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, last question before we sum up. Anybody? Please.
Hello. I'm
I think
Lieutenant,
yes, please go ahead.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Asanka Pallavatta. My question is also a little bit related to that climate change. When we think about those kind of innovative technologies and research regarding those things, for example, apart from the geoengineering side, we have renewable energy concerns and a lot of efforts throughout the world. But in each attempts, I think in each levels of research, they are contributing much more contributions for carbon footprint. So but the expected final outcome would be the eradication or mitigation of carbon. But at the initial, at this stage, however, there are a lot of contributions related to linked with a lot of carbon footprint. So how and what kind of approaches, alternatives can we think about, as the professor from the Eastern University has pointed out? What kind of conceptual approaches can we think about blending with this scientific research? That's my question.
I more or less agree with what you're suggesting, is that we have to find out workable, effective mitigation strategies. And in doing that, we have a whole range of agenda that has been given out. The only thing that we need to do is to accept them and implement them. We have to go for clean energy. We have to rethink our energy needs. We have to change the way we live today, the very consumer-based lifestyle that we are accustomed to. We have to find ways of changing those ways of living. We have to find out ways of the kind of heating that we use in our homes and houses, or the air conditioning that we're using. All those creature comforts that we're used to have to be rethought again. We have to have strategies in place where we can increase the forestation throughout the world. We have to find out smarter ways of commuting. So the electric cars, the hybrid cars are the way to go. So there are several of these mitigation techniques and strategies that have been given out, that is known to us, that has been accepted by nations. It only needs to be implemented. And we are extremely slow, we are extremely faulty in the ways we are implementing them. And that's where we have to all pull together. For example, one of the largest polluters in the world, the United States, today has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, saying that it does not believe that climate change is happening. So if that is the kind of understanding that we have in the international community, then we are in dire problems. We have to once again rethink our approaches as an international community, as we did in Paris. But the time is getting lost very fast, and we are at a crisis moment. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we had a very fruitful, very thought-provoking, intellectually stimulating discussion, and I thank the three speakers. Just a few points I thought I'll just sum up with. One is about leadership. You know, we talked of disruptions in the, this era of disruptions. And in this particular era, where things are moving so fast, you will find that with the change, with the rapidity of change, with the quantum of change, the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, the ambiguity in the environment increases. And to deal with this kind of a situation, I think we also need to be looking inwards into our leadership styles. Do we need to be having different leadership styles to be able to change, to deal with this rapidity of change, this quantum of change which is occurring at a very fast pace? Well, if you ask me personally, I've been asked this question a number of times because I do speak on leadership at a number of forums. You don't have to change the style per se, but yes, the leaders need to be versatile and they need to have mental agility. This is a very important requirement as far as leaders are concerned, to deal with fast-moving, fast-paced change which is occurring in the environment and which is creating this volatility, which is creating uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That is very important. And this can be done. If you go to train your people to have that mental agility and versatility to deal with various changing situations from time to time. The second point is that in such situations you will find, and time has come, ladies and gentlemen, with these disruptions taking place at the pace at which they are taking place, strategies will have to be flexible. We cannot afford to have a strategy, given a vision of 2020, for example. This was a buzzword in the United States when I did the US Army War College. Post 9/11, US Army came out with Vision 2020, and all armies of the world came on to Vision 2020. You cannot afford to be now looking beyond the horizon to a period of 20 years. It will have to be much lesser, 5 years to at best 10 years, because that's what you can crystal gaze in terms of whether what's going to happen disaster-wise or any other situation or any change which is going to be, upsetting your apple cart. And the other thing is that I think we need to exchange the best practices, because whatever happens, I think we need to adopt a push model than a pull model. What I observed as the chief was that, we had to virtually request the governments, the other armies, our DAs to get us the best practices based on a particular situation which was confronted by our military in a particular country. But I think we should be adopting, in the larger interest of humanity, a push model where the moment we carry out an analysis of a situation of this kind, we just disseminate, we disseminate and proliferate the best practices for humanity, for militaries to imbibe those, to make sure we can manage the disasters well in times to come. The other point is regarding the military being the first responder. This keeps coming again, and people keep giving various justifications that why the military is first responder. Well, agreed, it's got manpower, it's got everything. But ladies and gentlemen, it's an accountable instrument of national power, the military. We got to remember. It's the culture of this organization which makes it into a responsive, accountable element of national power. And it's the value-based organization where you will find people ensure that this organization becomes disciplined. And the culture of the military, the culture of the military all over the world is that the soldiers sleep with one boot on. Am I right or wrong? So that's the kind of preparation we have. We just take out in a jiffy the moment we are told. That's the kind of concept we have. So why the military is the first responder? It's because of the accountability. It's because of the preparedness. As I mentioned, one boot on, people sleep with one boot on. That's the kind, just a metaphorical sense I'm talking about. The last point which I want to give out is about the public information. It's my experience of what happened in Kerala, in one of our southern states. We do establish command centers to deal with these situations. Command centers which have got to be multi-agency with the civil control and other agencies working under it. But unity of effort only comes in through this control headquarters. And what is it that this control headquarters requires? It requires C2 structures. And they got to be, developed instantaneously. So when you talk in terms of coordination, it's not just the communications, it is interoperability. Interoperability in terms of, besides the communication, your concepts, your strategies, your standard operating procedures, your cultural understanding of each other. That's very important. So this is something which we have to look into. And getting back onto the issue of public information, this mechanism of a television, which are there in every country, they have got to be at that point of time virtually harnessed as one-time measure to make sure that messages are passed on to the people who are suffering, and also the coordination is affected through the TV channels, because otherwise the other communications are not working. Besides your mobiles, at times the mobile towers are down, your lines have been disrupted, the telephones are not working. So the media people, when they reach, they are the best people to communicate and pass on to the various substructures which are there as part of the overall mechanisms which is there put in place to deal with disaster. So these were some of the points, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's been a very fruitful discussion. Some very good points, some nuggets have come out, and I'm, of course, personally, I'm taking home a large number of points. There were good takeaways. Once again, thanking the panelists who indeed are great leaders, because one of the qualities of the leaders on the lighter side is to be brief and clarity and brevity in communications. So each one of them, never crossed their 20 minutes. And I suppose I am doing more. But with that, I once again would like to thank the commander of the Sri Lanka Army for having invited me here, for having organized this particular session. And thanks for your patience, ladies and gentlemen, to listening to all of us. Thanks a lot. Very good evening.